All right, welcome everybody. We're going to get started. So welcome to VEIC's second Clean Energy Call. VEIC is a sustainable energy company on a mission to generate the energy solutions the world needs. For over 30 years, VEIC has been working with governments, utilities, foundations, transit agencies, businesses across North America to develop and deploy clean energy services that provide immediate and lasting change. Our role as both implementers of energy efficiency programs and as consultants throughout the country has given us a direct view into the impacts that COVID has and will continue to have on clean energy work. And so we wanted to lean into the questions so many of us are grappling with. And during each of these clean energy calls, we'll hear from energy experts across the country to unpack the new sets of obstacles and opportunities we're facing and try and spotlight some smart strategies to move us forward. Today, we're going to focus our call on electric transportation. Transportation emissions, of course, the biggest source of carbon pollution, dominated by light-duty vehicles, making their electrification a central strategy. And also recognizing that driving an EV or any car isn't available or desirable for everybody, making better access to cleaner electric transit critical too. So thank you all for joining us today. And I also want to thank all the attendees who shared when they registered what they're interested in hearing from us. We'll try and work that into our discussion today as much as we can. My name is Dylan Voorhees, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. I'm a senior consultant at VEIC. I'm based in Augusta, Maine, where I've spent the last 15 years working on clean energy issues across a wide variety of topics. And I've spent those years working with a wide variety of stakeholders and energy experts. And so I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists today. And hopefully you can see them now in front of you. The first person I want to introduce is Noah Shaw. Noah is the co-chair of the renewable energy practice at Hodgson Russ. Noah and his colleagues work on a broad range of renewable energy, energy efficiency, and clean transportation market issues. Noah has also served as general counsel at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, or NYSERDA, and he's worked on New York State's electric vehicle initiatives and many others. Welcome, Noah. Jake Navarro is the director of clean transportation at National Grid. His team leads the creation of transportation-focused programs for National Grid customers in Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island, and focuses on increasing the number of electric vehicles on the road. Welcome, Jake. Jennifer Wallace-Broder is manager in VEIC's consulting division and oversees VEIC's transportation electrification work. She sets the strategic direction for VEIC's clean transportation programs and leads the team to support working solutions that reduce the environmental and economic impacts of energy use from the transportation sector. Jennifer serves as an expert in the Vermont legislature and provides strategic guidance on transportation policies. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thanks.
And Will Tour currently serves as the executive director of the Colorado Energy Office. Will was also the former director of transportation programs at the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project, or SWEEP. In addition, during Will's tenure on the Board of County Commissioners, at the Board of County Commissioners Boulder, Colorado, he spearheaded many efforts to support and develop sustainable energy, green building codes, and played a strong voice in the development of Boulder's community transit network. Welcome, Will. So we have three topics today that we're going to move through. We're going to first start by exploring what everyone is hearing and sensing, big picture from policymakers, from markets in the world that is changed around us. We're also going to talk about the value of EVs in reaching underserved populations and some of the challenges that brings. And then we're going to talk about taking electrification to scale and how we're thinking about that these days. I'm hoping to have the goal be a conversation that flows amongst us and gets you guys talking to each other as much as possible. So let's start with the really big picture. A fundamental question that we're interested in exploring. And that is, are you sensing from where you sit, interest in electrifying transportation increasing, perhaps as a result of public health or economic conditions? Or do you see EV investments getting set back as maybe not the priority right now? So let's start with the big picture. What are you hearing? What are you sensing right now that makes you lean one way or the other? Or what's changed in this world around us? And Jennifer, I'm going to start with you and invite anyone else to jump in or let the conversation unfold as it does. What do you think?
Sure. Thanks so much. I think, EV adoption was beginning to face some headwinds, I think, with some significant changes in federal policy, particularly the attempt to roll back the clean car standards and also the waiver that is actually the foundation for the ZEV, the Zero Emission Vehicle Program. So those are some things that were of concern. We also know that the tax credits are beginning to expire for some of the manufacturers at the federal level. So those have all been really significant key pieces of the puzzle that have enabled EV adoption and growth of the market. So I think that was of concern. And then COVID hit. And I think that is now beginning to have some impacts on the rollout of potentially popular models from the manufacturers. So I do think that we have some challenges ahead of us that some were anticipated, some were not. With that said, I've also been really encouraged by some of the activity that's happening at the state level. And I think we all may be able to acknowledge that the states and cities have been leading over the last few years on energy policy and climate. But it's particularly heartening to see that even within the last month or so, New York has come out with some significant announcements that will continue to hopefully grow the EV market there. We saw multiple states sign on to a ZEV MOU related to medium heavy duty trucks, including California and New York, or Colorado and New York. So I'm heartened to see that states are continuing to try to move forward. So I'm really interested in hearing our panelists today talk about, where they think we are. Is this encouraging? Is this enough to sort of overcome some of the headwinds that we're seeing? And maybe, Will, you could talk about it from the state perspective in Colorado, and then we could hear more from our friends in New York.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks, Jennifer. So, I think that what we are seeing is that at the state level, the drive towards vehicle electrification is, I would say, accelerating rather than going backwards. Clearly there are some very short-term market impacts, and I think we can all acknowledge that the automobile sales in general, went off a little bit of a cliff when COVID hit, and that certainly we anticipate that sales of all models are going to continue to be slow for a little while, and so in the very short term, we're not going to see the kind of EV sales that I think we had been seeing. But from sort of the bigger picture perspective, what I'm seeing is that state level policymakers are continuing to focus on EVs. In Colorado in April, our governor blessed a new state electric vehicle plan that sort of recommitted the state to achieving nearly 1 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030, and that for the first time put a stake in the ground that we're going to really focus on electrifying the medium and heavy duty sectors also. I think we're seeing multiple states that are exploring adoption of the zero emission vehicle standards. So last year, when Colorado became the first state in a decade to join the ZEV program, since then I think we have seen active conversations about this in places like Minnesota, New Mexico, Nevada. Yep. So something that at one time was really coastal, we're seeing everywhere. So I think we're continuing to see the momentum grow for state level policy.
Why do you think it matters? outside of those states. So you mentioned the ZEV adoption, but also this MOU. And so just to clarify for folks, this is a memorandum of understanding among more than a dozen states, a commitment to work on medium and heavy duty electrification, sort of collective effort. Why does that matter? You know, outside of, great for Colorado, Maine signed on to that too. So did New York. Just for a minute, why do you think that matters, big picture?
So, I think that there's a long history of state action on vehicles helping to move the entire market. And, if you look at the fact that between large states like California and New York, and then the many smaller states that have joined, I believe that on the ZEV side, you're talking over 35% of the vehicle market in the United States. That's large enough that I think that helps to move the entire marketplace.
Yeah.
The medium and heavy duty front, if you really have 15 states with markets as large as they do, collectively pushing for the goal of at least 30% of medium and heavy duty vehicle sales being zero emission by 2030, I think that that's giving some real certainty to manufacturers that they can make the investments that are going to be required to transform, the medium and heavy duty vehicle market.
Yeah. Okay. So Jennifer mentioned New York State. So Noah and Jake, I want to hear from you a little bit about what's the big news coming out of New York. Just give us, either one of you want to sort of give us a quick picture of what, and then same question. Why does that matter?
Yeah, I'll jump in first. I think the important sort of baseline to understand in New York is that all the progress that's happened in the last year or so has been the result of the climate bill that was signed by the governor last summer, which set a goal for 85% greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2050. And so in the interim, what you've seen happen in order to get to that, or start putting the pieces in place to get to that goal, is the formation of working groups and the commencement of regulatory proceedings and all the stuff the government does, and the further defining of what those goals really mean and what the targets in the transportation sector and every other sector should be to hit those numbers. The first major manifestation of progress was the order that I think Jennifer mentioned that came out of the Public Service Commission this summer, allocating over $700 million of ratepayer money to a variety of programs, quote unquote make ready programs. 590 million of that goes straight into utility incentive programs to build charging infrastructure. And then about $100 million goes to NYSERDA to implement 3 different sort of grant prize programs, many of which are geared toward environmental justice communities and creating sort of green, clean zones within those communities. You see a large, and I think this is getting back to another theme that I think we've been seeing throughout and related to COVID, is that the noises coming out of state governments in general are more and more in recognition of the disparate impacts of some of our historical practices on these communities of color, environmental justice communities, rural communities, and how these policies moving forward can correct those historical wrongs. And so that, I think New York State is now putting its money where its mouth is. It is targeting those funds in ways that are at least a beginning and a step forward with respect to the climate justice issues. And I think you're going to see more coming, in the not too distant future with respect to some of the more macroeconomic policy making. I think so. The story is good over the course of the last year, but it's been slow in coming. I wrote a piece last year called, Fast Chargers and Slow Progress, which was basically the New York State story. That's changed, luckily. But the COVID and sort of macroeconomic pressures and the scarcity of funds coming up will be, you know, kind of where the rubber hits the road in terms of getting the stuff implemented on any kind of a near-term timeframe.
Yeah, Jake, I'm not seeing your camera anymore. I don't know if you're having trouble or you're still with us. I want to hear from you. Are you there?
Uh-oh.
Maybe Jake's having a little connectivity issue. Nobody here, I'm sure, on the panel or in the attendance knows anything about connectivity issues in online meetings. Because I think this is a big deal for utilities and sounds like a big deal in New York. But let's come back to that as hopefully Jake gets his connectivity going. So let's talk a little bit about the cars and the trucks themselves for a minute. So they matter. At the end of the day, this is about vehicles, and they've got to be there for consumers. So we've seen a couple of, what I guess my question is sort of what's happening. What do you see happening? What should be happening? A couple of weeks ago, there was some announcements of some delays. People have been talking about Rivian's electric pickup truck. I can tell you people here in Maine are very eager to see electric pickup trucks. So a delay in Rivian's announcement on the one hand. On the other hand, if you look to 2021, 2022, there's probably half a dozen manufacturers rolling out electric pickups and SUVs. So glass is half full, glass is half empty. What are you seeing? Got some new models coming, some longer ranges. What are you sensing is happening with cars and their availability? Will, do you want to take a crack at that, or any of you?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I think that I would say that certainly from a Colorado perspective, we think that the availability of more electric models outside of the sedans is going to be critical. We need crossovers, SUVs, pickup trucks, and I think that it's clear that the models are coming. And again, there's some short-term delays, but we anticipate over the next several years a large number of crossovers and SUVs and a smaller number of pickup trucks hitting the market. One of the interesting pieces from a policy perspective, I would say, is that this is really what pushed the state of Colorado into adopting the ZEV standard, is that we were seeing that there was far more consumer demand for electric vehicles than actually availability of EVs on the lots. And when I think for us, sort of the tipping point was when Subaru announced that their first plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, the Subaru Crosstrek, were only going to go to ZEV states, even though Colorado had the highest Subaru market share in the country. And so I think that there's a real important public policy piece here to make sure that not only are the vehicles getting produced, but that they actually make it to the market in places where people will buy them.
Yep. Yeah. Good. Noah or Jennifer, what are you sensing about sort of what's happening with vehicles, and do you think COVID has changed that, or is, as Will said, is it really sort of some short-term market adjustments, and still what people need for vehicles is what people need for vehicles?
Well, I would say it has been challenging, the delay and the lack of availability of the most popular models. And so the SUVs and pickup trucks, I think we probably have a very similar need for those models in places like Vermont, New York. They're popular everywhere for a reason. But, at the same time, there's a really, and maybe this is a good segue to the next topic, but there's I think an open question about new models. How many people are buying new cars? And so what's the dynamic between needing to build a market of new models that can then feed a used market, and how critical is that used market really for getting to people that can't afford new cars, and then really building growth in the market in a much more broad-based way. So I think clearly having more models available is a really critical piece of the puzzle. And you know, I feel like since I've been working on electric vehicles, there's been speculation about what the manufacturers are doing and when. It seems to be getting better overall. It is disappointing that COVID has delayed things, but I agree with Bill that that's probably just a delay and not going to completely derail things. But at the same time, I think we have to think about, okay, how do we broaden the base of vehicles that are available that are electric to more people? And I think new cars are just one piece of that.
Yeah. Okay. So let's follow that a little bit, and hopefully Jake will be with us. He's working to get back online here. Let's talk about equity for a minute here. I think it's obvious that public health and racial equality and injustice are in the spotlight these days, and we're seeing some overlap in those, seen by disproportionate impacts of both traditional air pollution and now COVID on communities of color, on urban populations. I think just a heightened awareness of that. And so, you know, on the one hand, it could be that EVs are more critical than ever as we see, you know, healthier air and cleaner transportation that's accessible to those who need it. Or it's possible that EVs are still too expensive, and they exacerbate the risk of inequality in the transition to clean energy overall, which is a challenge whether you're talking about solar or you know, or other parts of the clean energy transition. So Noah, maybe I'll go to you and just sort of invite some top level, you know, reflections about whether you see clean transportation as an opportunity to address inequity, or there's really just a lot we still have to figure out to make that promise come true.
Both. It's definitely an opportunity, but we are really still at the very beginning of the process. You know, I mean, I think one of the criticisms, just coming back to New York for a moment, one of the criticisms of the order and sort of around the make ready order, if you will, is that of the more than $700 million allocated, only $10 million went to public transit authorities, you know, in order to try to get them to the goal that has been set for them to, you know, in New York State, to electrify their fleets to 25% by 2025. I mean, that's a huge transition for them, and they're not being given probably the support, both financial and otherwise, they need to actually accomplish that. So, you know, I think the right goals are starting to be set. I think there's still a lot to be said in terms of you know, the mechanics and the funding to get there. I will also say, you know, and I think this is true across the board, light duty, heavy duty, whatever, the cost issue is still just very difficult. But if you look at where the trend lines are going in terms of the cost of packs, you know, I think BNEF said you need to get the cost of packs down below $100 per kilowatt hour in order to make them cost competitive with gasoline engines. And that's going to happen here probably, you know, in the mid 2020s. So at that point, everything changes, right? Everything completely changes.
All right, so, we'll come back to that. Maybe as a tipping point, that something different happens there. What are you seeing in Colorado? Well, you know, the diesel emissions have been, you know, for a long time, you know, a real problem in urban communities, which are often low income communities of color. And so, you know, cleaning up diesel with electric vehicles seems like an opportunity to help communities that, you know, are struggling with decades of injustice that have put pollution into those communities. So do you think we can make this link real? Can we really leverage electric vehicles to make an impact in some of those communities? What's it look like from Colorado?
Well, I certainly hope so, and that's certainly a major focus of the state right now. You know, in the Colorado context, we have a set of neighborhoods at the north edge of Denver and going up into the next county to the north, where we have 3 major interstate highways with heavy truck traffic. We also have the local refinery and multiple other heavy industry, so that it is, probably the most polluted area in the state. Is also an area in which there's very, very heavy concentration of both low income and minority populations. And we know that improving air quality in that area is needed, both for sort of regional air quality purposes, but very much to address the localized injustices in the area. And there are a number of different elements of addressing that, but we think one big one is about cleaning up trucking. And so at the same time that we signed the MOU on zero emission vehicle trucks a few weeks ago, we also launched a stakeholder process to develop a Colorado specific clean trucking strategy, where multiple state agencies teaming up both with our local trucking association, but also multiple community groups, to look at both what do we need in terms of public investment, what sort of regulatory action do we need, what's the role of the utilities in both sort of this longer term transition to zero emission trucks, but also what can we do in the very short term to try to get some of the dirtiest old diesel trucks off the road that are really impacting these communities. So a lot of work still to be done, and I think there's kind of a regulatory and legislative agenda that comes out of this, but it's very much being centered in the need to address pollution impacts in those most impacted neighborhoods.
Jennifer, VEIC has worked on a variety of projects to try to help move electric vehicles in low-income populations in rural areas, to try and broaden the reach of who's thinking about EVs and who's benefiting from them. What are you learning about the barriers there, or the opportunities to broaden the population for electric vehicles?
Sure. I think one of the things that's been really important for us is to come at this fundamentally from a perspective that vehicles are about transportation, and transportation is about access to communities and jobs and services. And so when you talk about vehicle technology, you need to sort of put it within that ecosystem. And so particularly in, we happen to be based in Vermont, so we think a lot about rural areas that also tend to be have more low-income households. People tend to be a little bit more isolated, and it's much more challenging to serve people with transportation options that may require more density than you will find. So we've done some work here in Vermont, but we're also launching a project in upstate New York, funded by NYSERDA, to look at how you overcome some of the barriers to low and moderate income adoption in more rural areas and communities. And I think there's a lot that needs to be considered in that conversation. One is something I mentioned earlier, is how do you get people into, and Noah mentioned too, the price is a significant issue. So there's a number of ways you can look at that, but things like access to credit come into the conversation, the availability of used vehicles, and by that I don't mean just models, but just is it on the lot in your local dealership, which may be a small dealership in a rural area, and it may be challenging for them to actually become an EV dealer. So there's a lot wrapped up in that. I think another angle that we're going to be looking at is how do people charge at home if they don't have a single family home? And that is a hot topic, I think, in many places. Many people are thinking about multi-unit dwellings and how you provide access to charging in venues like that. But it's something that has to be addressed if you're going to open this up to more people that maybe don't own their own home but rent in an apartment building, either in an urban area or a rural area. So we're definitely going to be digging into some of those issues, but I think that clearly incentives are a really important aspect of it. Getting charging into more locations that are different, that maybe include public, but you've got to look at the barriers and the issues that come with multi-unit dwellings. And then clearly transit is a whole nother conversation that I think is really critical in urban areas. And that's, you know, people are maybe less likely to have cars and more reliant on transportation in urban areas. So that I think electrification is really critical.
So, well, let's talk about transit in just a moment. But one of the things I want to follow on what you just said is really trying to understand. You know, transportation is about it's about a service. It's not about a thing. It's about getting to where you need to go, and it needs to work for your where you live, where you work, who you are. And so understanding that seems critical. You know, we're now a panel of 4. We're all white, mostly male, probably all pretty privileged as things go. And so how do we sort of check our assumptions, and as we not only talk about but try to develop solutions that work for a wider, more inclusive audience when we're coming from the backgrounds that we are? What realities do we need to keep in mind, and how do we do that as we talk about serving disadvantaged populations? Anyone want to take it?
I mean, I think
Yeah.
the best way to do that is to make sure that, you know, the people making the decisions don't all look like us.
Yeah.
And they come from a variety of the backgrounds, and make sure that, you know, the folks in power and who are determining strategy and allocating public funding, et cetera, are a diverse set of people who can draw from personal experiences. I mean, my personal experience is growing up in a little tiny town in the Adirondacks. So I have that perspective, but I don't have any of the other perspectives. And I think it's important that we don't pretend that we do. And, you know, in addition to the decision makers and wanting to make sure that they, you know, have a diverse set of views and life experiences, one of the things that certainly in my time at NYSERDA, we made a real effort to get right. We didn't always get it right, but we made a real effort to get it right. Was, you know, the stakeholder process. You know, it can, a lot of people roll their eyes, and sometimes those working groups can seem Sisyphean, but it's really important to make sure that, you know, as part of the regulatory process or the funding, you know, decision-making process, that all the voices are at the table and that there is a record of that input. Because if there isn't, then even decision makers who maybe don't have those personal experiences, you know, won't have their sort of feet held to the fire to make sure that they're acknowledging the different situations.
So do you think, and you can't answer NYSERDA, but can you think of institutions or places or circumstances where the inclusivity of decision makers is happening? Do you see, and this can be for any of you, can you name sort of examples of where folks who don't often get a seat at the table, or whose life experiences aren't necessarily as represented in decision making, are getting a seat at the table and are being, you know, put on boards, put on committees, put in, you know, hired into, you know, key can you think of examples of where that's happening in your states and your communities, or is there a model we can look to of success?
Dylan,
Anyway.
this is Jake. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
So apologies for the technical difficulties. I'm back. I think I'm probably audio only.
Okay.
I'll try to rejoin on video. Yeah, I mean, so I think, first of all, I totally agree with everything that Noah just said. I think the one thing I would add to it, and to respond to your question, Dylan, is I actually think it has to start even earlier than sort of the stakeholder process for ideas that, institutions like my own, like a utility, have. I think the engagement with, a really sort of diverse group of, customers and partners has to actually start at the beginning, right? So I think one of the things that, at least at National Grid, we're getting better at, we're definitely not perfect at it, but we're getting better at it, is rather than try to identify what the customer problem is ourselves and then come up with our own kind of, technical solution to it, we're trying to actually engage with those customers themselves and ask them, what's the problem? What are your challenges? And then try to work with them to help come up with the solutions. And so, Dylan, I think, to answer your question, like I said, we're definitely not perfect at it, but one of the things we're getting better at, and one of the really cool things about a utility, is we have to serve everyone. And we get to serve everyone. And so we actually have an incredibly representative customer base. And the fact that we have access to those folks and we're getting better at asking them to be part of the solution is something that's really encouraging to me, and something that we've really focused on in recent years. So,
Jake, I'm gonna follow up with you a little bit and sort of get a little bit more specific about that. So whether it's New York or Rhode Island or other places the National Grid is, and we were talking a little bit about the big New York announcement, but I know Grid is making investments across jurisdictions. How do you bring an equity lens to thinking about those make-ready investments? That's a lot of money going into charging stations, and a lot of opportunity for equitable or inequitable, investments that affect, where charging is and what the opportunity is. Can you talk a little bit about how National Grid or utilities generally bringing equity lens to where the rubber meets the road in terms of investing hundreds of millions of dollars?
Yeah, for sure. And, I don't know if I could speak for other utilities, too much, but certainly the way we think about it at National Grid, I think there's kind of, two big pieces of this. One is kind of what I just mentioned, right? Which is that we need to do a better job, and we're getting better at talking to customers, not just the customer who might be able to afford a Tesla, but the customer who maybe can't, could only afford a used vehicle, or maybe doesn't want to own a car at all, right? And so we need to talk to those customers about what the challenges what the challenges are that they have, and how we can come up with ways for them to have access to this electrification of transportation, evolution that we're going through. I think the other thing is focus, right? This has to be a part of our mission, has to be ensuring that equitable access of this stuff. And so, a couple of the conclusions that has led us to is that even though, make ready for commercial public charging is sort of the biggest thrust of what we're doing today, it's certainly the biggest thrust of the New York order, which we're tremendously excited about, and working on figuring out how we're going to implement that over the next couple of months. But it's also led us to, a real core belief that those, that public charging is not the only solution. It can't be the only thing we focus on. Some of the key things, and I'm not sure if other folks talked about this during the couple minutes I missed here, but things like electrification of public transit bus fleets, right? That has to be part of the solution. Electrification of school buses, that has to be part of the solution, because that's how big swaths of our customer base can also participate in this in this transition, rather than us kind of putting public chargers that check a box but are in a perhaps a dense urban community that they're not going to get utilized, right? The buses and the school buses are where we're going to make a difference there. Good.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, and Jennifer was starting to bring up buses a minute ago, and so we're it's always been true that there's sets of folks for whom car ownership is not affordable, it's not practical, it's not desirable. Certainly traditionally those have been folks, again, maybe of limited income, or the senior citizen who's just aged out of driving a car. And now it's in, I think more recently, and I'm interested to see if you think COVID has impacted this, a bunch of folks who could own a car. There may be a millennial in a city, or someone else that is looking to ditch the car. So there seems like there's a bunch of different populations for whom car ownership just isn't the right answer, and cleaner fleets is an opportunity to bring benefits to those folks. So let's talk about some of the opportunities and barriers for that. And Jennifer, I don't know if you want to sort of pick up, or any of you, what do you see happening? Do you see COVID changing how we're moving forward with electrifying buses, one kind or another?
I would hope that COVID is actually putting the gas on this one, because this to me is such an obvious opportunity to start to clean up transportation, particularly in urban areas that have high levels of pollution and have really been impacted health-wise. So I would hope that maybe the other panelists can help verify if that's true, but I would hope that that's really accelerating that conversation. Clearly, I think transit and school bus electrification offer such incredible opportunities for health improvements in terms of, having no tailpipe emissions, and people riding in proximity to those can really benefit. I think there's also some real benefits to transit, particularly around operational savings. Not quite, I think there are operational savings with school buses too, but the price differential is so significant and they don't drive as much that that's a little bit more challenging. But I think there are multiple benefits that can help with the operational needs of those fleets plus health. So I think there's a lot of good reasons to move forward with that, but I'm really interested to hear if that is accelerating, or if there's even more heightened conversation about that. And maybe Will could start with that one, since you've jumped in on the ZEV on the ZEV issue on this one.
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of sort of complicated cross currents here. First, would very much agree with the way that I think Dylan was starting to frame this, that if we're going to achieve sort of broader community goals and our climate goals, that it can't all be just about electrifying cars, that there's a much bigger sort of transportation world that's out there. In all of our analysis, we've concluded that in addition to widespread electrification, we need to reduce the gross in vehicle miles traveled significantly if we're going to achieve our climate goals. And so when we look at the short-term impacts from COVID and potentially some longer-term impacts, there are, again, several cross-cutting things where we're seeing, a reduction in vehicle miles traveled, largely driven by, the vast increases in telecommuting, and looking at what we can do from a public policy perspective to help maintain high levels of telecommuting going forward. We're seeing our public transit system in crisis. So, the combination of just sort of the economic hit to transit agency budgets and the fact that people, rightly or wrongly, are scared to be, getting on a bus with a whole bunch of other folks. We've got ridership has gone off a cliff during COVID. A lot of concern about what that's going to do to people's, habits and comfort with transit going forward. So we see sort of real challenges for our transit system right now, and a lot of work going on and thinking about just how do we keep public transit functional going forward. And there's certainly still an interest in and focus in electrification of transit, but I would say it's taking a little bit of a backseat compared to where we were pre-COVID, just because of the overall crisis of transit. then the one other piece that I would say that we're seeing some interesting opportunities is really around electric bikes. And we're working right now on standing up a program around trying to increase e-bike access for low-income essential workers who may previously have used transit but don't have access to it right now because of all the service cutbacks. We've had like 40% service cutbacks. And so really trying to see where there may be opportunities to pivot to supportive e-bikes in addition to transit electrification.
So this brings up, I want to talk about getting to scale. Maybe this is a good bit of transition too, but a lot of this comes down to where's the money. No, a minute ago you sort of were reflecting that the commitment, the dollar commitment has to be there, and maybe some sense there's a lot of money flowing, or on tap to flow in New York, but is there enough on transit? Will, you've talked about service cutbacks that have to do with health issues, but also have to do with the fiscal crisis that a lot of states and municipalities are in now. So let's talk for a minute about where the money comes from. And so in New York, we see a large investment from ratepayers. In most states, we've seen VW settlement funds play a really important role. What do you see coming ahead? And do you think COVID and on the health side and on the fiscal side has changed how people are thinking about where's the investment going to come from in electrifying transportation? It's always the $1 million question, or if you're New York, it's the $1 billion question.
Yeah, well, New York, $1 billion doesn't go as far in New York as it does in other places, but
yeah.
It does happen to be the 11th biggest economy in the world. So the only other, the thing that I would say is that, we don't really understand what all the follow-on economic and behavioral impacts are going to be from COVID right now. But certainly there's going to be less money in every pot, whether it's, state, city, transit authority general funds, whether it's ratepayer sort of appetite to continue to fund programs through public service commissions and otherwise, or whether it's programs that may be coming down the pike, like the Transportation Climate Initiative, and sort of the transportation version of RGGI, the cap and trade. What are you going to do with that money? And as we all with RGGI, sometimes money gets spent in ways that are less than sort of squarely within the idea of how the funding would originally be allocated. So I think I don't have an answer to the question. What I would say is that we should be looking to pots of money that where the eligibility for expenditures is as narrowly focused on this work as possible, so that we're not necessarily relying on sort of the political decision making regarding large pots of money where that money could be allocated to any number of purposes, because there are going to be incredibly important strains on those budgets for health and safety issues. It's just, and reducing greenhouse, moving that curve in terms of greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector out a couple of years is going to seem like not an important thing to a lot of decision makers when they're looking at some of the more urgent stuff that their constituents are banging on their door about.
So you gotta have some dedicated funding. And that is one of the appealing things I would guess about some of the utility investments. So those need to be really targeted at benefiting utility customers. So that's there. I think with TCI, obviously the states are still facing choices about how those monies are spent, and there has been a lot of conversation about not just using it for clean transportation, but using it to benefit everybody, and particularly to really put a thumb on the scale to benefit the populations that have been left out of investments in clean energy that we've been talking about. But I want to move us along to talk about going to scale a little bit, because part of the inclusivity is we want everybody to be benefiting from this transition, and that means going to scale. And there's new challenges to going big. And Jake, I want to ask you to sort of chime in, because utilities think about the long term. You know, the 10-year planning is, you know, what you do for breakfast, and in a lot of ways. And so while a lot of people are out there still saying, what's an EV? You know, you guys have to be thinking about, well, what happens when everybody has an EV? So how's that going? what support do you need to be thinking about going to scale? Because it is, I think, the utilities are one of the key areas for really examining what does this look like as we start to go big. We stop worrying about what the first car or truck is going to do on the system, and start worrying about, you know, 70%. So walk us through that, and you see anything, you know, changing there, and are you optimistic? What needs to happen next?
So I think we're actually focusing on both, right? We're focusing on both the first, maybe it's not the first car anymore, but it's the, you know, 60,000th car. Mm-hmm. But, you know, as well as that long-term vision. So, you know, it's something that as a company, we've been thinking about for a long time. And, you know, our transmission planning, our distribution planning, you know, we have forecasts for, you know, EVs on the road and how our systems might be able to handle that. And I think we're pretty confident in our ability to build out the system in a way that supports you know, a much more scale up version of EVs. I think over the, you know, sort of much more short or medium term, you know, the scalability question is coming home for us, you know, less on the system planning side and more on, you know, just being able to implement a really big you know, make ready program like what we're going to see in New York, right? So we've had a you know, public charging make ready program in New York for the last 3 years, and it's been really, really successful. We've launched about 900 ports through that program, which was, you know, about double what we thought we would. But if you look at our portion of the order that was issued in July, that's going to be more than 16,000 ports, right? So that's more than an order of magnitude higher for us. And so that's one of the things that myself and my team are really focused on, is like, okay, this is going to be different. We got to do things a little bit, you know, less on the back of a napkin and more, you know, more in a much more organized way, and scale this thing up so it's a good customer experience. So I would also just say, you know, even though we are focused on what do things look like at scale and how do we deal with this at scale, I think one of our big concerns, less from a, you know, how does our business deal with this perspective, and more from a what does our business believe in kind of perspective, is, you know, what more do we need from a public policy, regulatory, you know, the competitive environment to actually reach that scale, right? Because if we think about, I'll use New York as the example again. The ZEV MOU, which we talked about the medium and heavy duty ZEV MOU earlier, but there's also the light duty ZEV MOU, which is pretty important. It's been around a little bit longer. So that says by 2025, New York will have 850,000 vehicles on the road, electric vehicles on the road. Right now, I think it's between 50 and 60,000, right? So that's not very much time. You think about what percentage of the population is actually going to buy a car in the next 5 years. And that starts to come home really quickly, and so that's an even bigger concern, I think, for at least my part of the company right now.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
So you know, Jake, this is not going to be personal towards you, but you know, in order to make this happen, it can't take 6 months to get through an interconnection, you know, process with a utility to install a fast charger, right? I mean, in order to get through this process. While I understand the utilities need to, you know, have their investors in mind and be maximizing their revenue on a per plug basis, that's what their business is. They have to be cooperative when it comes to rate design, demand charges, you know, in order for us to get to our goals. So there's going to be, and frankly, culture change among some of the sort of frontline people at utilities who, and this is, you know, the only bureaucracies that I've worked at the Department of Energy, and large state entities, the only bureaucracies that I found that are more difficult to deal with than those ones are utilities. And it's, there's hardwired stuff that happens on the edge of the organizations with the interface with customers and developers. That's just, it's got to change in a fundamental way if we're going to push the pig through the garden hose, if you will. So I just, it's a challenge, and my clients deal with it on a daily basis.
Now,
Well,
listen, I think that's
quickly. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, I would say that's right on. That it's certainly something, an evolution we're going through as a utility. We're dealing with 100 years of really focusing almost exclusively on resiliency, and that's still got to be our focus as we do a bunch of other things. But you're totally right. It can't take 6 months. We got to speed these things up and make sure it's a better customer experience.
So we're getting close to the end of an hour here, and I think I've covered a lot of ground, and I'm interested in giving each of you really just 30 seconds concluding thoughts, and it might be, the one thing that you think you think people should be paying more attention to, whether it's just a fundamental of electric transportation or it's something that is happening, an opportunity that you think we should be seizing given the unusual times we're in. What's the one thing that you think people aren't paying attention to enough that you think they should be? So I'm gonna go to you, Will. We just have time for a quick one.
So pivoting away from the current dysfunctional federal debate around fuel economy standards to moving towards a national ZEV standard on the trajectory that's going to be needed to achieve our climate goals and give the certainty that the industry needs, both utility industry and auto manufacturers going forward.
Noah, what's the one insight you think people are needing to pay more attention to?
We spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to make this market work through interventions and buying down costs that are otherwise upside down in terms of the incentives. And so I think, elections matter, and depending on what happens in November, we have an opportunity to put a lot more public money into bringing the overall cost of the technology down a lot faster. We saw how that can happen in the Obama administration with solar, et cetera. If we can get the per pack cost of lithium ion batteries to a level where vehicles are competitive on a model by model basis, everything else changes really fast.
Okay. Jake, how about you? What's your one last thought for folks?
I mean, I would say, one of the big things for us is charging behavior, right? It's a little bit of a tricky subject because we don't want to do anything that would make life more difficult or make an EV less attractive to somebody. But I also believe that, now is the time that we got to focus on figuring out how we can, help customers who have EVs, whether they're, commercial fleets or just individual residential customers, shift their charging behavior in a way that, adds value to the grid and adds value to the other customers who are helping to pay for it. Now's the time we got to do that, because once we get to a sort of more mature market level, the toothpaste will be out of the tube on being able to really, have an impact on how people charge their cars.
Okay. And Jennifer, last word. What's the one thing you think people should be thinking about that maybe they're not as focused on as they should be?
So I think this conversation is really about the merging of two sectors, the transportation sector and the electricity sector. And as we actually need to rapidly electrify, we've actually need to figure out how to bridge the conversation between those two sectors, have a better understanding of the operational needs of transportation fleets, the operational needs of utilities, and figure out how we can be talking in the same language and rowing in the same direction to collectively make this transition. So I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done there to make this all work.
Excellent. So I am going to thank all of you, all of our panelists and all the attendees for a great conversation today. This is the contact information is up on folks' screen for our panelists. You can follow up if you have more questions. VEIC will be posting this video on our website, and we encourage you to contact us if you have questions about this or the opportunities or what we're doing in this. And I hope you'll stay tuned for the next clean energy call that the VEIC is going to present. So thank you again, Will and Noah and Jennifer and Jake, for a great conversation. Hope you all have a wonderful and safe afternoon.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.